Andrea, thanks for dropping by. Unusual, white wine, but in a minute when I have my tea it's white fish. So I thought we'll have some white wine. And in addition to that, I'm lightly, not definitely, going to be out all day tomorrow. And if that happens I might not be back till quite late. And this will keep better in the fridge than an open bottle of red wine. Because I won't be finishing it tonight, that's for sure. Right, answers to the Q's and A's session. And again, I'm filming this on Friday simply because if I go out tomorrow, I really will be out all day. I'll be off at like 7 in the morning and probably not back till 7 at night. Not definite yet, but I've nearly made my mind up. I don't know why I'm hesitating really. Am I going to sneeze? Yes, excuse me. Well, at least I get a warning. And I'm one of those that sneezes properly. I don't need 4 or 5 to do it. 1 will do, thank you. The job's done now. I think. Having said that, I better go again. Right, so the day out tomorrow, if I do it, will consist of a trip to Burnham's with a stop at my favourite place for breakfast, which I will aim to get to the breakfast place for bang on 9 o'clock. That gives me time to have the breakfast leisurely and still get to Burnham's for when they open at 10. Now, part of the reason for going is I'm tempted by the fact that it's an open weekend, which Sarah now only does once a month. She opens weekdays every day, but weekends she only does once a month. And this weekend, anything you buy at the till is 15% off. That's a substantial discount. That's it's not going to pay for my petrol, but it's a nice incentive. And quite honestly, I can get, every now and again I stop and think about it and I get quite fed up with just being here all the time. It gets tedious after a while. Now, I know the cost of the fuel's high and everything, but I just thought I want a day out, so I'm going to have a day out basically. So the trip will be to Burnham's, and then sometime after lunch I will set off home, and on the way home I'm going to peel off and go to a bonsai nursery. Now, I don't know how good, bad or indifferent that's going to be, because all I know about it is what I've seen on their website. That could be 2 or 3 years out of date. I might get there and they've got hardly any trees and it's hardly worth the trip. But it's about a 13 or 14 mile detour to get there. That's not a lot, it's going to 10-15 minutes and I'll be there, and then the same back again and I'm back on my normal route home. It might be brilliant and I might spend quite a bit of time there. I might get there and it's closed, so we shall see. So that's tomorrow, but today, Q's and A's. Now, normally when I get a session like this, I go through the questions before I start filming so that I know roughly what to expect. And I thought, well, it's a little bit cheating, I suppose. Well, no, it's not really. But what I thought just dead ahead of me is the enormous black hair type infundibulum, or an infundibulum, whichever you like. And it hasn't long gone out of bloom. It had some on a shorter cane, and then there's the huge big long cane that nearly touches the roof that had its last flower that faded a while ago. And there's 2 or 3 enormous buds on the top of that cane, again out of the same bit, straight out the top of the cane. Sidetracked, you know me. Right, so I haven't prepared this time, so it's going to be spontaneous answers, which might include I haven't got a clue. Which under normal circumstances I might actually bother looking up, but I'm just going to go for it. Right, I've reversed these round, so the newest one is at the top, I'm starting at the bottom. And Incy was in there like a shot, and his question is, I'll think of something. Well, I don't think he did. But he got in there first. Right, so the first proper question is from 90s Kid. I'll read it out. Just a technical question. I'm new to advanced orchid keeping. Not quite sure what that means. And I've gotten myself a parts per million and pH meter just today. Well done. You have several videos on recalibrating the pH meter. Yeah, they're edited. I take the swear words out. They are a pain, those things. When do I know if it needs some doing up and if it's actually measuring correct? You get the powders, which if you follow the instructions precisely with the exact amount of pure water and it needs to be right, at roughly the right temperature, and you mix the powder up, make sure it's dissolved, then when you put your pH meter in, it should read what it says on the powder, and if it doesn't, you adjust it. If you've got a non-adjustable one, you've got a problem, unless it's spot on. And then the best thing I've found is to then mix up some Orchid fertiliser straight after you've calibrated your pH meter, and get that Orchid fertiliser at a known parts per million that's easily recreatable. So you'll be using your other meter now. So again, you mix up some feed in the water that you use all the time. If that's RO water, fair enough, or whatever. Rainwater's a bit iffy because it does vary. But add some fertiliser, the stuff you normally use, and measure the parts per million. The TDS meters, parts per million, they come pre-calibrated. They're normally as near as damn it spot on, and they very rarely go wrong. So they're the good one. So they're relatively trustworthy. So do something like if you normally feed at say 150 parts per million, normally, you may not know how you feed, but get a known parts per million, then measure the pH, yeah? And then every now and again, you can use your pH meter at that set parts per million to see if your pH meter is still accurate. Because having just recalibrated it and at a set parts per million it gave you a reading of this, if when you try it in a month's time it's out by a reasonable amount, it needs recalibrating because it's gone off, because you have a known fixed parts per million and a known pH that it should achieve. So that's how I do it anyway. And at the moment I'm using my K-Lite at 120 parts per million, which comes out at a pH of 5.8. So I'm not even getting my pH meter out. I don't even check it because I know what it'll be. So the chances are, having not used it for ages, it's gone off. Anyway, have fun with them. They are a nuisance. Right, KT. Yay, Q&A time. Thanks, Roger. When mounting orchids, what determines whether to put sphagnum or other types of moss under or over the roots? Is it how thick or thin are the roots? The need to be kept dry or moister between waterings? If it came from cool montane forests, humid forests, evergreen lowland forests, etc. Thanks. Well, in there you've practically answered your own question, because in asking the question you know the variables already. Yeah, so you're nearly there. But my determination is mainly, how do I need to look after this in winter? If it's a drier in winter type orchid, then I don't want that much moss anyway, and the chances are it'll go on top of the roots. Yeah, I don't use the sphagnum moss anymore, I use live moss. I've got different grades of live moss. The grade of the live moss, i.e. how coarse or how fine it is what goes with the actual roots. So fine roots, like say Tolumnias, something like that, will get the fine grade moss. Heavier roots, like on some of the dendrobiums, will get a coarser grade moss. So that's how I work. I don't very often put moss underneath the roots anymore. The problem being, my memory still goes back to the Orchid Society, the sphagnum moss, which goes off, and if it's under the roots you've got to unmount the orchid. If you only put moss on top of the roots, if you ever need to change the moss for any reason at all, you can take it off those roots reasonably easy and replace it. So that's the logic there. Do you know how nurseries in your country, they still do their own breeding and register hybrids to the RHS? Well, Burnham's do. Hardy Orchid Society probably does, but that's not the sort of orchids I grow. Orchid Botanics Trey, no, he only buys in, grows on, splits, divides and sells. He doesn't breed as far as I know. There aren't many, and if there are any others I'll apologise for not knowing, but they're not ones that I use. But Spice Exotic imports and buys, I don't believe they breed. It's quite a big deal. I've actually got some friends that do it, but they do it on a private nature. You know, they do their own thing and they sell on to friends, members of the Orchid Society, that society. But they're getting thin on the ground. There's not many of those left. So Burnham still does, I think. They certainly have done, and they have quite a few of their own registered hybrids. Whether they're still actively doing it or not, I don't know. So the problem is they will have lost some of their market due to Brexit. So whereas before, the progeny, you know, when they come out of the flask and everything, could be sellable to other European, you know, orchid nurseries, but that's a big deal now, crossing the English Channel. There's some people do it in little boats every day. They don't seem to need any paperwork. But try and get a plant across. The logic is illogical. Right, a bit more wine, otherwise I get told off for not drinking it. This is a grin on my face, I am only joking, it is a running gag. Right, that one was posted by Petra Pills. The previous one was posted by KT, capital K, capital T. And sorry I forgot to mention it at the time. Right, Ernest Luthringer. Not from these parts, I suspect. Have you ever tried to grow and care for an Angola? Blah, blah, blah. Well, the simple answer is no, I don't like them. So that's a direct question, do I? Have I tried? And the answer is simple, no. So I'm going to leave that one at that. I know nothing about them because I don't grow them, and I don't bother checking out how to grow things and all about them until I get one. So things keep distracting me out the corner of my eye. I've got birds flying all around the garden and butterflies flitting around, so I keep checking what's going on out there. We did have a sparrowhawk in the garden, which with the excess of sparrows I've got completely dominating the bird feeder, was quite welcome. Didn't actually do anything, came in, landed on the fence and disappeared. But we've had one in the garden, good. Right, next one, Shari Cochurns, I think that says. So you have to excuse me, I've got this on small at the moment and my vision's a little blurry because of the light. But, I'm managing. Roger. A while back you said you were going to buy a Den Trigonopus. What happened? You've missed a couple of videos because this came back from the Malvern show. I bought it from Trey Saunders, and basically he had a couple at the show to sell, and he had one in the display that actually had blooms on, and he let me have the one from the display despite the show not being finished, which is a little naughty. So there we go, Dendrobium trigonopus. It had blooms on when I got it. They didn't last too long. The next lot of blooms I get will last because they'll be my blooms, so they'll be acclimatised. But it's a nice little plant. It was in bloom, and since the blooms have dropped, it's got a nice strong new growth coming. So yes, I did get Dendrobium trigonopus, and there'll be a pop-up of what it looked like with the blooms on while they were there. So that's that. Right, next one is from Sarara, I think, S-A-R-A-I-R-A. I spell it out, it's easier than trying to sell it necessarily. And my tripod seems to be wobbling my laptop around. It's top heavy, that's all it is. I knocked it with my foot. Right, I have a question about orchids in the wild. I've seen some sources say that certain epiphytic orchids can tolerate snow and freeze, like Vanda caerulea, and some dendrobiums. How do they survive if their roots are exposed? it's rare, let's put it this way. You get the Neophonetia falcata, the wind orchid, grows wild in valleys, in forested valleys in Japan. They can get snow on them and survive, but the first thing you would realise is that where those are growing, they get dry cold winters, not soggy wet ones like we get in the UK. So I've also heard of people in certain areas of the States that leave their orchids out, and they've had those with snow on and down to freezing. Some of the native orchids in Australia actually go down to freezing and survive, and some of the northern Chinese orchids can go down to virtually freezing. So yes, it does happen, and yes, it's true. It's rare, and I wouldn't risk it in cultivation, because it's a different climatic experience. Where you're going to get those sort of environments, you're going to be high up under normal circumstances. The air is thinner, it's drier. It's a different atmospheric thing to what you may be able to be thinking of. So yes, it can happen. Yes, they do survive. And the fact that the roots are exposed, not all of the roots are exposed. So it may lose the tips, the growing tips on some roots, but not all of them. Not recommended. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't do it. I'm going to be going down to 12 degrees centigrade. That'll be my winter temperature in here, and that's controlled, obviously. So, my eyes are struggling at the moment. What's happened, I'm afraid, as I've started filming, is I get a type of migraine that gives me slightly blurred vision, and that's going on at the moment. Now, I don't get any headaches or any warning shots or anything, it just happens. And I'm reluctant to stop filming. If I can get away with it, I might have to, because I'm having trouble reading, obviously. So the next one's from Simply Orchids, etc. etc. Hi Roger, I heard some part of the UK are going through heat waves now. How are your orchids doing in these types of weathers? Thank you, have a good day. Thank you for saying. Right, heat wave. Had I been in my old place, if you were subscribed back in those days, I'd have struggled badly, because my old place was kept, it got sun. It got sun for, like, this time of year would be like 11, 12 hours a day. It started at, mid-morning and stopped when the sun set. And sun on glass generates severe amounts of heat. And I had an extractor fan and an inlet fan to change the air and have a cooling effect. So under a thermostatic control, I had a cooling ability. When the temperature outside is 35 degrees, it ain't gonna work. And I'd have suffered badly in the old place. Here, the sun hits the roof, half of it, for about 4 hours of the day. And that's all I get, because it faces north here, the other one faced southwest. And at the moment, the sun is halfway across the roof, because the days are getting shorter, the sun's getting lower at its height. And I'm currently at 22 degrees. In that hot phase, when outside it was well over 30, which happened for a fair old period of time, the highest I got to in here was 28. And that's without anything other than one simple circulating fan. So I've got away with it because this conservatory faces north and it gets very little sun on it. Unfortunately, there's a downside. In the spring, when I could have done with the rise in temperatures to get everything going, I didn't get it, did I? So everything started growing really late. And I'm going to have to acclimatise to that, as well as the orchids. So that's that. But I did okay. The orchids did okay. I won't say I did okay. Cats took no notice of it. Right, now we've got Squeaky 35. Years back when I was keeping orchids, the whole ppm and pH thing wasn't a thing in those days, as I remember. Are they really that important? Well, you could say yes and no. Many people do okay without mucking about with all that. Yes. Some people, if you talk to them about parts per million or microsiemens, they don't know what the hell you're talking about, and they're growing perfectly good orchids, so you could say yes and no. It's all geared up to trying to fine-tune your ability to grow orchids to get the best out of them. Yeah? And if by knowing exactly how strong your feed is and getting it at a suitable pH for your orchids is going to help them grow better than they are now, then it's worth doing. But if you're happy with the way your orchids are at the moment and it's working for you, well then perhaps you don't need to muck about with these fiddly little things, especially the pH meters. They can be a trial, to say the least. There's a whole vocabulary of swear words specially devoted for pH meters. Right, I can't read that. I think it says Tovet T, but it might say TC vet, see, which isn't that's a word it has no sense to it. TCV doesn't work, so it might be TOV. Sorry about the eyes, but that's how they are at the moment. Can you explain how to take care of black hair type dendrobiums? Is there anything particular we should watch for? Yes, rotting roots. They are renowned for it, and they are scale magnets across the genus, basically. Both of those things are true. Some are very difficult to grow and some are pretty straightforward, but the mechanics of growing black hair type apply to most. And if you remember, the really unusual black hair type that I've had two lots of and lost them both eventually is the Dendrobium senile, which has very pale grey silver hairs, and yet it's still in that group, the black hair type. So that's an unusual one. Most of the others have, to one degree or another, some black hairs on the canes. The new canes, they tend to disappear as the canes get older. Right, there are two things going on with these types of orchids. They are either growing or they're not. And those things can happen at all times of the year because they can put up new growths any time of year. And this is the bit you've got to adjust to. Is this plant growing? Is it putting out growth? That growth can be new roots on a cane that's mature and stopped growing. Or it could be a cane that's growing with no new roots yet. But is it doing anything? Is it growing? And if it is, it will need some water and some feed, irrespective of the time of year. But then you have to look at the rate of growth, and depending on your night temperatures, and your minimum temperatures, these don't like to get cold. But they come from places variable in elevation, so different temperature ranges, but they're classed as intermediate and some are classed as warm. I don't think there's any cool growers in amongst them, so they don't like to get cold. If, however, you can't help that because that's your winter temperatures, then that new growth that you had coming on in autumn is probably going to slow down and stop if it gets too cold. And you're thinking in your mind, I've got a nice new growth there, let's chuck water on it. But you do that when it's cold and the roots will rot. That is their one difficulty. The roots rot. You've only got to look at them, basically, and the roots rot. So you've got to go very, very careful with your watering. Not so much your feeding. The feeding's geared up to, is it growing? Is it growing? It wants some food. But the amount of moisture around the roots has got to be geared up to active growth only and nowhere near as much despite the active growth if it's cold, which in my place in the winter it would be. So that one that I've just said about with the buds coming out the top has also got a new cane pushing up a stonking new cane. That's in active growth and the roots are going mad, so that gets watered, yeah, and gets fed. But I've still got a bit of growing season to go yet before we start getting cold temperatures at night, so that one's fine. But you can, if you've got like half a dozen black hair types, different types, species, some hybrids, they're not all going to be doing the same thing at the same time. So you've got to go careful. You can't just say, it's Thursday, I'm watering all of them, when some of them are in effect dormant. There's no new growths growing, there's no active root activity, and perhaps they finished blooming a few weeks ago. They don't need much water at all. Even if it's warm, they don't need much at all. So watch your roots, watch your watering. I've been caught many times. I will probably get caught again because they catch me out. Something wicked. Right, where have we got to? Matthew Lynch. Thanks for doing another Q's and A's. You're welcome. I get 2 videos out of it. I'm happy, and we have a bit of a laugh while we're doing it. So I was just curious about the results from last year's Miltonia feeding project. Right, many of you may have missed this. I had, in fact, I can hold them up. Last year, I chose these 2 Miltonias because they were almost identical. You know, they had the same number of new growths. They were liable to do exactly the same thing, and they were roughly the same size. Yeah. So basically, I did a feeding project where one of them got fed and watered with all the other plants, which you know with me that's relatively low levels and more frequent perhaps than some others do, you know, the once a week brigade. And the other one got like double the feed level. So every time I watered, one of them got at least twice as much, twice as, you know, strong a feed parts per million. So whereas one might be getting say 150, the other was getting 300. And did it make any difference? If it did, I couldn't see it. So it's non-conclusive. That's not scientific, basically, because they weren't exactly the same plant. Otherwise, you know, and it's impossible to get exactly the same plant, quite honestly. You know, it only wants one to have a few more roots, and it's not the same plant, is it? You know. So anyway, the results were inconclusive, but I couldn't see any main differences. So what do you assume by that? Well, you assume by that I was wasting my money feeding the other one a lot higher than the one that didn't get the food. And that's the only conclusion I've made. It didn't need to have that level of feed. So that was that one. Right. Wanda Shaw, regular commenter. Any tips for a first time Zygo hybrid mum? Yeah, I have actually. I laugh because I never had the tips for quite a while, and I just kept killing the blighters, one after the other. And a couple of those along the way were really strong, healthy plants when I got them. They didn't stay like that, did they? And most of the time it seemed that they keeled over after repotting. And a lot of the time the repotting was not long after blooming because the new growth seemed to come around that time, but something was not right. I was getting it wrong all the time. And then I got given advice. So the advice you're going to get is what I got given, which I now know works because, you know, I've got zygos that are coming into bloom and pushing up new growth, so the advice works. Most of them are classed as shady. They've got quite a temperature range, the actual species, so you can't determine that. Some of them grow right down near sea level. They're really warm growers. They grow in swamps. They're soaking wet all the time. Some of them are standing in water and others are up the top of the tree. So you can't give a generalisation for a genus that has that amount of variety in the species. And when you get into hybrids, you know, mixing those things together, it doesn't always work. If you've got one that's constantly wet with its feet, you know, in a bog, you know, in swampy conditions, and one that's all light and airy at the top of the tree, you think, well, if I've got those two crossed together, I need to aim at the middle. It doesn't always work like that. One of them could be dominant and the other one almost negligible, so it doesn't always work like that. But basically, the advice I was given was stop this heavy shade nonsense and get them in pretty good light. The reason is they will respond to it and become more vigorous and want to grow faster. Number one. Number two, don't even think about repotting until you see some new roots starting, and don't let those roots get too long. Next, don't dramatically change the media when you repot. If you want to change it dramatically, you're going to have to do it a couple of stages at a time, because you'll lose the old root system. So if you're coming out of, say you bought one that was in sphagnum moss and you I don't like that, it's going in bark. If you do that in one go, you'll probably lose all your old roots. You might get away with it if you get a substantial new root system, because you repotted at the right time, when the new roots are coming. When you get to know your plant well, you can preempt the repotting time by the stage of the new growth. Because often the new roots don't come out as the new growth starts. It comes out when the new growth's about halfway up, and then the new roots start. Well, once you know that that's what your plant does, you can plan your repotting. Don't let the media get stale. And you need a media that holds a reasonable amount of moisture but is still pretty well drained, in other words, not compacted. They need air around the roots, they need moisture around the roots, and there we go back to, I used to let mine get almost dry. Well, that was when they were heavily shaded and they weren't growing very well, they weren't growing very quickly. By adding the light level in, and hopefully a bit of temperature as well, they respond by wanting to grow. Now you can get more water and feed into them, because they'll use it. So that was the advice I was given, and it seems to have worked. So I'm happy to pass it on. Gail Cunningham. I hope you're being silly here. It's not going to happen, let's put it that way. That's before I read the question out. It's not going to happen. But thanks for the offer. Would you fly to the Pacific Northwest for a Yamadori trek into the Olympic National Forest if I send you the plane, comforts, cosy blue blanket and 5-word search magazines and wine gumdrops, and I would provide a lovely picnic lunch for the trek? This is geared up to following an email with a link that actually it's people going and collecting bonsai, well, potential bonsai trees up in this Olympic National Forest, whatever the hell that is. But it was an interesting video, I did watch it and I enjoyed it. If you did that in any forests that weren't private land with permission in this country, you'd get arrested for a start. You can't just go around digging up trees in the forest in this country. Every tree in this country is owned by someone. So unless somebody said, yes, you can have that tree, you're stealing in effect. You know, that's how it is. Of course, you'd have to leave the Yamadori for me to shape, because it probably wouldn't make it through the agricultural restrictions in the UK. You probably wouldn't get it out of your country either, come to think of it, and it would have to have a seat on its own on the plane, wouldn't it? You know, bought 2 tickets, one for me tree and one for me. You know, so it's a lovely idea. I mean, I've had several invites to come to the States with accommodation, to go to like one of the major big orchid shows and things like that. Quite honestly, all I've got to do is say 3 words: cats, orchids, bonsai. And the fact that I haven't got anybody to just drop in and deal with those things. I haven't had a holiday for donkeys. The last time I went away, and that was only for 5 days, was it 5 or 6? I went to visit Rachel in Northern Ireland. So, you know, you're looking at short flight. Spent more time on the coach getting to her place than I did on the flight. But, you know, no major big deal being away from this. I've tied myself down, basically. That's how it's got to stay. That's a lovely offer. You've heard me talk of Zaina. She was... what was she? She was a big deal in the Orchid Society of Great Britain, and she moved to northern Italy with her other half, and I got an invite to go there with Hannah and look at all the wild orchids, because she lives, you know, literally on the edge of where most of their native orchids can be found. But I just can't do the going away thing. It's sad, isn't it? But my choices. Right, next one, besotted orchids. Roger, I have a Miltonia that instead of forming spikes forms new growths in that spot. Do you know why? I don't know whether you're talking species or hybrid, but what I do know is you can get genetic deformities due to hybrids that are not quite compatible, and they start doing some strange things. I mean, I've had a zygopetalum hybrid that grew its bulb and its leaves and all looked fine, and then it grew another bulb on top of the bulb. That's not normal. So I have seen some abnormalities, and normally it's a genetic related issue with hybrids. You don't very often see that with species, I must admit. But a Miltonia has got its low level leaves and then its bigger leaves all coming out the side, and it's got its pair of leaves coming out the top of the bulb. The spike comes out from one of those leaf joints. It doesn't come out from the base of the bulb, it comes out normally from inside of one of those little short leaves, I call them bract leaves, from the base, and it's tucked down in there. Now that's actually normally where the new growth comes from as well. So that's what would be normal. You can get some deformities. And another from Gail Cunningham. Have you ever used, I can't even say that, but I know what she means, the fungi that you get with our native orchids? An awful lot of them, if you dig them up and take them home, they're going to die because they have a relationship with some fungi in the soil. Without that, they cannot germinate and they can't survive, because it's a relationship that helps them get their nutrients, basically. Have I ever tried messing about with that? No. Will Miltonia thrive in 50% humidity? I'd say they do okay, mainly more hybrids than species perhaps, but Miltonias are not a high humidity requiring orchid. They'll put up with it, and they might do a bit better at around the 70% mark, but if you start going too high with them, it messes their metabolism up, because if they've got really high humidity around them, they have the difficulty in getting the hydration and everything through the plant and out the top. So humidity affects that, but they should do all right at 50%. Depends on the temperature. You can get away with lower humidity if your temperatures aren't too high. If you've got high temperatures, like if I was at 32 degrees in here, 50% humidity would be a waste of time. There'd be orchids suffering. And it would need to be 70 plus at those temperatures. This morning when I came out here, it was 19 degrees and I had 85% humidity. Those orchids would have been perfectly happy at 50% humidity at 19 degrees, but I get the reverse effect. Because things get watered during the day, the water gets in the air, which is fine during the day, but when the temperature drops at night, the relative humidity rockets. I mean, in the other place, I used to come down and it was 100% and everything was, the windows were all running water. That's too much. That starts creating mould issues and stuff. Right. Michelle's life on replete with chronic illness. Black hair type dendrobiums. Mine are fading to a lighter green, pale yellow. Is this too much light or too much water? In my experience, it could be one of quite a few things. It could be too much water, but indirectly it could be not enough. It could be that there has been too much water and the roots have gone. Yeah? So now they can't hydrate properly. So it's not enough water, but watering them isn't going to solve it because the roots have gone. It's catch-22. This is what I said, the roots are a real problem on these things. It can be too much light. It can just be that your plant is turning its toes up. And the first sign of that is the leaves will go yellow and drop. Black hair types are deciduous eventually. In their perfect world, where they're happy as the butcher's dog, as they say, those leaves will stay on those plants quite a long time. In the not so happy world, where it's not quite as perfect as it should be, they will be deciduous sooner. In a world where they're not very happy at all, they can be annually deciduous and you can end up with a plant with no leaves left at all until a new growth comes. And in that state it can't feed itself. It's going to survive on its stored resources only because there's no leaves. It can still survive and it may still push up new growths, but it could be one of many reasons, unfortunately. Right, we've still got quite a few to go. Can we just have a quick look at the time? How's the time going? Where are we? No, I'm going to cut off there and call that part one. Mainly because the video will just be too long. Hang on, let me just have a look and see how many's left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, there's only 6 left. I'll leave it. You can have a long one. If I break it to part 1 and part 2, I'm only going to have to film part 2 anyway, and I need to film that today. So we will carry on. Right, we've got, oh, I love this one, Will Air at 26A Toady. Now that might have been a string of letters that meant something entirely different, but that's how I read it. I quite like that channel name, I don't know why. See, now I would analyse that, probably totally wrong. This is a guy called Will, who perhaps was a pilot or flew a lot, and he lives at 26A. What the toady bit is, I don't know. Right. If you were in a situation where dubious sphagnum moss was all you could get for orchid mounts, well, it would have to be hypothetical because I can always go out and get live moss in the wild. I've got an abundance in many places near me. Would you use it, and when would you check for replacing? If I wasn't happy with the quality of sphagnum moss, it would be replaced annually, whether that was on a mount or in a pot. The good quality long strand New Zealand moss, that's a couple of species that are heavy duty, they're coarse, they're pretty good. That can go 2 years, providing it's not really soggy and starts to compact. But it can hold quite a bit of air and an awful lot of moisture. So would you ever consider mounting an orchid without any moss at all? Yes, and then I wouldn't do it. The problem with starting an orchid off with no moss at all, don't get me wrong, there are instances where I would start an orchid off with some moss, and once it established a good root system and was well attached, I'd be happy to take the moss off and leave it without any, but I think initially it's going to have a change of environment at the root level, so to have some moisture around the roots is going to help it become established. So that would be that. Subject to humidity, of course, 50% 9 months of the year. If I only had 50% humidity, I'd have to think seriously about growing mounted orchids unless I could really get the water on there a couple of times a day when it's warm. But to get round that, use the moss would be my simple answer. If you're going to mount orchids in low humidity environments, you're going to need to keep their roots humid. And if you had a bare rooted plant in that dry atmosphere, then you can absolutely soak that. An hour later it's probably going to be dry, and that's too quick. So bear that in mind. Right, Tan Malin. It's a new one. Hi Roger, what would you suggest as a good starter orchid for growing in the home, not Phalaenopsis, not including Phalaenopsis? I have north and south facing windows and humidity usually around 65 to 70% as I grow houseplants anyway, thanks in advance. You've got quite a few choices with that level of humidity. I haven't got a temperature range there, but if you're growing in the home, I always assume that in a home the humans are comfortable. And if the humans are comfortable, there's a range of orchids that will be comfortable in that environment, and with that level of humidity you've just upped your choices a bit. If you can get the bright light up the bright light end, then there are an awful lot of the Cattleya Alliance that will do well for you. You've also got the ability to choose some of the resting dendrobiums, because again, they don't need the bright light to grow, and they don't need high temperatures to grow, but what they do need is a bit of a chill in the winter. So if you've got a room where you can give them brighter light and less temperature, then there's a range of those that you could grow. The Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums are normally pretty easy to get hold of. They will turn up in the, in the supermarkets and garden centres. They don't like to get cold. They don't like, well, they don't need bright light. So they're okay in the home environment, as are the nobile hybrids, Dendrobium nobile hybrids. And there's a range of colours and sizes, but you do have to bear in mind that some of them do grow pretty tall. Just as an example, as far as size is concerned, that's the only reason I'm picking this up. This is not what it says on the label, but this is actually a Phalaenopsis type. And when it grew this cane last time round, I was surprised because I wasn't expecting it to be that big. And it's doing it again now, and look at them roots. So this is a vigorous growing Phalaenopsis type. I could pick another one up and show you an almost miserable failure, but I can't get at it without moving, moving all the stuff. But yes, the nobile type hybrids will grow happily in the home. So will the Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums. So that's two types of dendrobiums you can have a look at, and Cattleya types. Just Cattleya hybrids, just generally speaking. If it's Cattleya and something, blah 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 in quotes, it's a hybrid and it will probably do fine. Some of the Cattleya types, it might be called Cattleya, but it might have a high percentage of Laelia in it, and some of those Laelias are highlight orchids, and without that light they'll grow happily and they'll look wonderful, but they won't bloom. So you have to choose a little bit. But yeah, you've got choices. There's an awful lot of the Oncidium alliance will grow happily in the home. They don't need the high light. They're quite tolerant of temperature ranges, and with that level of humidity they'll be happy. And again, they're readily available. They turn up all over the place. A word of warning, watch Nelliilas that turn up in amongst them. They're fussy. They don't grow as easy. And the main reason is they've got a high percentage of odontoglossum in them. And the odontoglossums in the main have been reclassified as oncidiums, and without that knowledge the care is totally different. Odontoglossums are really cool growers, and a lot of them are cloud forest orchids. The general oncidiums are not. So the care is quite different for those two. So watch the Nelliila. It turns up in amongst those types of orchids frequently. And they're a little bit fussy. Oh. And then the next one says, not a question but a suggestion for a video. So I'll leave that one. Moving on, we have Danny 7890. Hi Roger from the US. I'm new to your channel. Welcome. Great to watch, by the way. Thank you. Thanks for taking our questions. Have you any experience with summer blooming phals? Most of the what I call store-bought Phalaenopsis, the mass-produced things from the Netherlands and from Germany and that in the EU anyway. I don't know about the States, how they're produced, but they're cloned basically, and they are mass-produced in huge numbers, and most of those have been changed in their makeup to work as houseplants. And as houseplants, it is expected that come the autumn time in the EU, the night temperatures drop down a bit. And it's not perhaps cold enough yet to start putting your heating on in your house. It's okay. You might need a jumper on in the evening perhaps, or a cardi, the buttons up the front when you're doing your knitting. But yeah, and they've been bred so that the drop in temperatures that you get in the autumn triggers the spikes. So those type mainly bloom in the winter and early spring. Depends how long the spike takes to grow from when it's triggered. But there are some that are genuine summer bloomers, and their spike is triggered by the lengthening day lengths and the rise in temperatures. And I haven't got any of those, so I haven't really got any experience of them. I only have one species that's not doing very well, but it might do better now it's been buried in the deepest shade because I was giving it far too much light, and that's Spiolacea. So I do have one species, but whether that comes into that category or not, I don't know. But there are a good smattering of the species. I don't, Phalaenopsis species, I think there's about 30, something like that. We did have a specialist talk on Phalaenopsis once, and he did say the precise number and showed the map where they came from. I think there's one from Australia, one. But anyway, I don't have any of those, so quite honestly I haven't got the experience of those. But by definition I would say that their spike is triggered by a rise in temperature and an increase in day length. So that's a lot easier to do, quite honestly, or it should be. Right, so that's that one. Interested in info on indoor winter care. But again, if I don't grow them, so I wouldn't really know. But if they're summer blooming, gear yourself up to increasing temperature and light levels and day length in the spring, whichever part of the world you're in. So as I say, if you're in the bottom end of the world, hanging on by, because you don't want to fall off, then obviously spring is the 6 months away. But yeah. I would go along with that. Oh, hello, we got another Dendrobium black hair type. See, by the number of questions, they're obviously a problem, aren't they? Or I wouldn't keep getting all the questions. They are a problem for me as well, although I've got some growing really well. I've lost some as well. I lost Formosum not that long ago. I got fed up with looking at it with no roots and no new growth, so I dumped it. I've got some on mounts, some in pots, it does vary, but they are a little bit finicky. Right, so what was the question then? This is from Zula. What's your feeding parts per million recipe for this type of Dendrobium? Do you feed it when in full bloom? Thanks in advance. Right, firstly, I have separate feed levels for what I call my cooler shady types. That's Restrepias, Masdevallias, Draculas, Miltoniopsis. They have a different feeding regime. Everything else gets the same. So that's part of your question answered straight away. If I'm feeding the orchids, they all get it. Yeah? And at the moment we're going for the light feeding frequently. We've done that on and off throughout the period I've been growing orchids. And this is an experiment, not only doing that, but in addition changing the type of feed to a very high nitrogen feed and low pK values, and we'll see how that goes. I can't give an answer on that yet, it's too soon. I don't stop feeding an orchid because it's in bloom, because again, I would have to have 2 lots, wouldn't I? I'm going round, I'm feeding all the pots today, and I'm not doing that one, that one, that one and that one because they're in bloom. Do you think Mother Nature stops washing down those nutrients on the whole tree when there's 30 orchids on that tree and that one out there's in bloom? No, that one's not getting any. Yeah? No, you're not having any. All the others can have some, but they get what they're given. So I certainly don't stop feeding as a plant's in bloom. I mean, it might be growing some new growths as well. I mean, some orchids are doing everything all at once. They're pushing new growths up, they're blooming on an old cane or bulb, and they're growing new roots. They're doing everything. I could do with some more of them. So, simple answer to that one. And the last one, Judy this is. I have Epidendrum orange blazer. That's going to be orange blaze, I've heard of that. Typo, I suspect. Epidendrum orange blaze. And once upon a time I was looking at that, why? Can't remember. But it's made up of I can't remember, but it's got 2 Epidendrum species in there. But the question is, apart from the fact I can't find much information on how to look after it, wants to know if it's what's classed as a reed stem epidendrum. From what I can remember, it's made up of 3 parts and 2 are standard epidendrums that, as far as I know, haven't been reclassified, and as such, yes, it is. They tend to be summer epiphytes and or terrestrials, because they are often found growing on the ground in the leaf litter and that. Some epidendrums, the radicans types, people in the right environment with the right temperatures and everything, chuck them in the garden, in the garden border, and they grow into a bush, and they get full sun, and they're burnt to a crisp, but they bloom their heads off. Strange plant. But yes, I would say that given its makeup, it would be classed as a reed stem. With those, they are prone to kikis, and some of the kikis will be quite close to the base, and the roots will get down into whatever media you've got. In active growth, they're quite heavy drinkers and feeders, so they do need help to keep that growth going. Many have cluster blooms with new buds coming out the top, but there are some, and I think one of the ones involved with the makeup of this hybrid, it has a spike about that long with a bloom on the end, so not so elegant. And it may be that that one had a beautiful colour and shape, and everything about it was really good, apart from the long stem and the fact that there weren't many blooms. So by hybridising with the others, you brought the length of the spike down and maintained some of that colour. So that's probably what's happened there. Can't guarantee it. But yeah, treat it as a reed stem. Semi-terrestrial, because some are, some aren't. So it still needs air around the roots. You could even mount it, but you'd have to keep it well watered. And it's one of those that when it's in active growth, it's going to need pushing. You need to keep it well watered and everything. And then there'll come a time when it's not growing, and that's when you need to reduce the watering down. That applies to all orchids, quite honestly. See, there are some orchids that just grow throughout the year, so that statement becomes silly. Things like masdevallias, they're on the go all the time. Whereas there's some orchids that they have periods of growth when stuff's going on and periods when there's nothing going on. And that's when you have to adjust your watering, or you're liable to mess your roots up. So there we go, long video. That's a variety of questions. There's a high number of black hair type questions. I think I might put a video together on those where I can gather all mine together, and we'll have a look at all of them and just have a more precise chat about them. It's much easier to chat about types of plants when you've got them under your nose rather than in the distance growing buds that you didn't even know you had. So yeah, it sounds like that might be a good one to do. So there we go. On the end of this video, I'll put a link to the playlist of the questions and answers. So if you like this type of thing, not the questions bit, that's just put your comments here. The answers bit, there's a playlist with all of those in, that you might want to go and have a look at some of the others. They are random questions, and sometimes so are the answers. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed that. It's a bit of fun, and hopefully there's some useful information gone out, not only to the person that asked the question, but to others who didn't ask that question, but it's still pertinent or relevant. That's a big word, or relevant. That's a more normal word. If I do my day out tomorrow, there won't be a video, but I will be filming at Burnham's, and hopefully I'll be filming at the bonsai nursery, so there will be videos to come, but they will be out into next week, simply because Sunday will get in the way and we'll have our Sunday chat. If I don't go out tomorrow and change my mind, then I'll film something. Yet undetermined. So thanks for dropping by, hope you've enjoyed it, and if you haven't subscribed, it would be nice if you did so. I've clicked over the 13,000 subscribers now, which is greatly appreciated, and my channel has steady growth, so it's good stuff. So thanks a bunch for those who have, and thanks in advance for those that might do it now. I'm watching you. Are you doing it? You doing it? Oh, thank you. Well done. See you next time.